Thank you once again, and thank you, Dr. Jarman, for that talk. I'm going to now shift us to having a conversation on the common research um, methods and resources, and and then we'll shift over to Dr. Palmer. So when I think of the roadmap for the next couple of slides that I'll talk about, one is on what is the critical appraisal framework, right? So someone came up, had that question earlier, like how do you critically appraise or evaluate any paper? Um, what's the study design deep dive? So what's the population measurement sample size? I'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk a little bit more about bias and confounding. I know I introduced those topics earlier, but we'll go a little bit more, and then some key statistical concepts, p-values, confidence intervals, power effect size, and things like that. And then go into some of the evidence resources, such as like the databases, the checklists, and the guidelines. Um, so when you think of critical appraisal, the most common what people tend to do is what's called the IMRAD, or the Introduction Methods and Results and Discussion framework. And so for this, in your introduction, you're really thinking to yourself, like, is this research question clearly stated? Did they say what they wanted to answer? Is there, is the prior literature reviewed accurate? Usually when people start off a study, they'll say, okay, this is what is currently known about this subject or this topic. Is the study rationale justified? Usually you around somewhere in the second paragraph, people will say, like, this is why we're doing the study because of XYZ thing. And then is the study hypothesis explicit, right? Like, did they explicitly state that this is what the hypothesis is, what the expected outcome, or this is what they're interested in finding in the study? And then from a method standpoint, right, is the study design appropriate for the question? Because as I noted earlier, there's multiple different types of study design, but some of them are a little bit better for others than dependent on the type of conditions or the how rare a disease may be. So you have to figure out, is it the right design for that question? And as Dr. Drummond mentioned, like you want to start off with your question and then get the design in the database. Do you have the right study population where the inclusion and criteria and exclusion criteria met? What was the measurement methods? Were they valid and reliable? And then was the sample size appropriate and power calculation included in this? And then from your results, were the results presented objectively, without any bias? Are there any descriptive statistics that were reported? What tables and figures are they self-explanatory? Do they make sense? Does this easy to understand? And then are the statistical tests appropriate for the data type, right? One of the things you'll learn in the course later on this summer is that depending on the kind of data, you will do different statistical tests. And then in the discussion section, usually, were the conclusions supported by the data, right? Is this what they're trying to say founded in the evidence? Are there limitations acknowledged honestly? Every single paper has limitation. There's not a paper that's without limitation, and so where they acknowledge it. Was there a source of bias discussed, if it exists? And then what's the clinical relevance versus the statistical relevance? And so sometimes you'll see, we'll talk about this a lot, where like something may be statistically relevant or significant, but is it really clinically relevant? Although there may be a 1% difference between these two groups, is that 1% difference statistically significant? I mean, clinically relevant? If it's something as big as mortality, then probably yes. But if it's not, is it? And so when we think about designing these studies and thinking about this population and sampling, right? You have your overall target population, right? But then you want to do the sample population, right? You can include every single person that you would want to include into a study. And so you kind of have to somehow figure out like how do you get the study population? And then of that, like how do you get your study data? And so there's a couple of things that to keep in mind. One is like internal validity, right? And so do the results accurately reflect what happened in the study? Were they ensured by standardized protocols or defined criteria? External validity, right? Can these results be generalized to the target population, right? Or improved by multi-center design or broad inclusion, right? Like if you took this study and you applied it somewhere else, would it still be true? And then representatives, this, right? Like, did they have a good response rate? Usually when we think about response rates for surveys, for example, we want, or for interviews, you want somewhere around like 80% is great. That's good. But, 50% could be really good, depending on the type of study. Less than 30%, usually that's like a serious concern. Like, why did so many people not respond to the survey or not follow up? And then there's always going to be loss to follow up in any study that we do. And then when you think about the measurement quality, like the two things that always come up is like reliability and validity. And so, for something, you don't want something that's not precise and not valid. And so you're kind of like this intervention is kind of hitting all these different targets, but not in a recognized pattern. It's not consistent. You're not really sure. You want some, here you're precise, you're hitting the same places, but it's not valid because it doesn't fall into the concentric circle. And then here you're not precise, but you're valid because they're all kind of like relatively aligned. And then here you're precise and valid, which is ideal, right? And so having that precision is important because it's consistency of the measurement, right? So you get the same result when you repeat it. And so low reliability, you need a not, so you will need a larger sample. However, for the validity of the trueness of the study, right, is like measures what is supposed to be measured, right? Does it reflect freedom from systematic error? And then the accuracy combines both high precision and high validity. And only then is the measurement instrument trustworthy, right? And so when you think about these surveys, when you think about these tools, you have to think to yourself, like, is this reliable and is it valid? And if it is, then that increases the accuracy of the measurement or the tool. And then when we think about sample size and statistical power, I think one is the effect size. Like, how big of a difference are you trying to detect? The smaller the effect you're trying to see, the larger sample size you will need. And so you have to think to yourself, like, if this is a disease that's highly prevalent, but you're only trying to see a difference of like maybe 1%, but you have millions of patients, then you'll be able to do that with the effect size. But you'll need less. But if it's a disease that's really rare and you're trying to show the same size effect, you're probably in a much larger population because it's a rare condition. And so you have to kind of think through like what are the trade-offs you're willing to make, and what's the prevalence of this condition or of the intervention that you're trying to assess. And then when you talk about power, you're really talking about the probability of detecting a real effect. And so the standard is usually set at 80%. But with if it's underpowered, then you can miss real differences, and so you have to be mindful of those things. And then with significance, usually it's acceptable, like, this is an acceptable false positive rate, right? And so usually we set it at zero point zero 0.05. And so for some other studies, you may need a stricter threshold, so like zero point zero 0.01. But most studies will set it at a p-value of less than zero point zero 0.05. And then the variability, right, of the standard deviation of like the greater spread in an outcome, the larger sample is needed to like see a signal through this noise, right? And so if you have too small population, you may not have low power, so your real differences may go undetected. So you're underpowered for the study. It's usually, we'll talk about it during the summer course. This could be potentially like what we call a type 2 error, expose patients to risk without chance of meaningful result, or you could be too large where you have an unnecessary patient exposure or resource use, but you justify sample size before starting in the study protocol. And you have to be mindful that like any significantly large population can demonstrate significant finding because they are extremely large sample. Now, bias and confounding, and I talked a little bit about these biases earlier, but I'll go into them a little bit more here. But like this selection bias, right? And so this is when a systematic difference in who is recruited versus excluded. And so healthier patients more likely to enroll in trials. And so you have to be mindful of these things. You could fix them by defining the inclusion exclusion criteria. You could do random sampling, usually will prevent reduce some of the selection bias. I would say prevent, you can't totally prevent these things, but you can reduce them. Recall biases, especially like, you know, um, It's hard to recall past exposures differently from controls. And so sometimes people that have been exposed to something have different recall than those who haven't been exposed to it. And so you have to be mindful. So cancer patients are more carefully recall like chemical exposures than non-cancer patients. And so a way to address this is, do a prospective study or think about objective records rather than self-report, where, you're at risk of recall. Confounding, right? So this is that third variable associated with both the exposure and the outcome. And so, for instance, like, is coffee a confounder for lung cancer? And so you may think that it is, but what you may realize is that smoking is the confounder because everyone who drinks coffee in the study hypothetically say they were also smokers. And so it wasn't really the coffee, it was the fact that they were smokers. And so you have to think about like what are the potential confounders and understanding the disease condition is important to kind of think about those through in the beginning of a research project. You could fix these by randomization, stratification, as well as multivariable or multivariate adjustment if you're doing it in a retrospective fashion. And then this publication bias, right, that exists and like positive results are more likely to be published than negative or null results where there was no difference. And so this creates an artificially like positive evidence base in meta-analyses. And so you have to be mindful. And so like, that's why you have to register your trial before you do them. It's really important because people want to know, even if you have negative results, it's important to report that. And then you think about these funnel plots and meta-analysis will help kind of remove some of this publication bias that exists. A couple of statistical concepts and what they actually mean. So, earlier I said p-value, but really, what it means is just that it's the probability of observing this result, or more extreme, if the null hypothesis is true. And so what it's not is it's not the probability the result is due to chance, not a measure of effect size, right? It just tells you that the probability of observing this result, if the null hypothesis is true. The confidence interval is a range, what can contain the true parameter. And this can kind of either get wider or smaller depending on what you're looking for. And then you have these measurements of effect size. So these are your odds ratios, your relative risk, your hazard ratios. But these assess like the magnitude of the difference or association. So, as I said earlier, like statistical significance does not equal clinical significance, but you have to be careful because a large enough study can make any difference significant. And what I say for these things is like, I always think about like if you're trying to say what is the true height of the average person in the population, and you have 10 people, then your confidence interval is going to be really wide because you're just making this assumption, you're doing this observation, you're testing this on 10 people. If you use 100 people, your confidence interval starts to shrink. If you use 1,000 people, your confidence interval is getting smaller and smaller. And if you use 10,000 people, then it's going to be really small because you're getting closer to what the like actual size of the population may be of interest, but your cohort is becoming large enough and it's going to get you closer to the truth. And so your confidence intervals shrink. Couple of the reporting guidelines and checklists that you should be familiar with. One is consort. It's usually for randomized clinical trials. The strobe, and I put the websites there, but again, we'll share these slides. Usually used for cohort or case control of cross-sectional trials. START is for diagnostic test accuracy. We don't use that one as much, but definitely Prisma for systematic reviews and meta-analyses. And so just again, a couple of other databases and resources, PubMed, Medline, great resources for looking at the literature, finding scientific articles. The Cochrane Library, I talked about that one. It's the gold standard for meta-analyses and systematic reviews. You could always search on clinicaltrials.gov to kind of see what trials have been done. Point of care, so up-to-date Dynamed, GMKA, right? All of these are excellent point of care references. And then there's other evidence synthesis databases like TRIP and Embase for a broader search. So again, other tools to be used. And then the hierarchy of evidence, right? When we think of like, earlier I was talking about, right, these expert opinions, editorial, case reports, and as you move up on this pyramid, right, to get to these systematic reviews and meta-analysis. That's where you have your highest level of evidence. And then when you think about how do you critically appraise or check, kind of review, have your checklist, here's one that I use and you can kind of, and I'll share with you all, but you have it, right? But it kind of goes through these like, from a design population, is the study design appropriate for the research question? Is the population accurate? Did what methods did they use? Is this powered? What are the biases that may exist in the study? What are the results? Are the effect size and confidence intervals reported alongside the p-values? And then the conclusions, right? Do they overreach or not? And then if there's any conflicts, right? So there may be a conflict of interest because of funding sources or others. And so these are things to note as you're trying to review an article. And then so I'll end on this slide of just a couple of key takeaways. One, again, like that, IMRAD structure of like introduction, methods, results, discussion. Always approach every article and think critically of each of those sections. We talked a little bit about sample size planning is not negotiable, ethical requirement. You have to kind of think through like what you want and what the population is. Your bias and confounding require, active countermeasures. And so what are the things that you can do to try to reduce that within the study? P-values are usually not insufficient, right? You always need to know what the effect size is or what the confidence intervals are. And then again, using reporting guidelines and evidence hierarchies as you do your studies.